Ukrainian jets Russian base. The impact shattered a fortified node worth tens of millions. 10 a Ukrainian MiG-29, skimmed across the Sursane frontier at just 47 ft, pushing nearly 500 knots. Its target, a converted Russian logistics depot storing drone guidance hardware valued at tens of millions. The pilot expected resistance. He did not expect it this early. Two flashes erupted from a tree line ahead. Not warnings, not tests. Full Eagler launches. Two missiles fired less than 4 seconds apart. The first raced past his canopy. The second drifted wide after a hard left brake that cost him almost 160 lb of fuel. The air remained silent, but those rising smoke spirals marked his presence across 15 mi of Russian positions. And this is where I want your thoughts. If the very first attack of the mission came this fast, would you continue pressing toward the target or abort and climb out? 10 a.m. The air above Sursane lay flat and colorless. The kind of quiet that makes every shadow feel like a warning. Skimming just 48 ft above the frozen ground, a Ukrainian MiG-29 slipped across the front line with the calm precision of a surgeon's blade. This was not the attack run, not yet. His first task was to confirm whether a nondescript industrial warehouse, one the Russians had quietly absorbed into their network, had truly become a new relay point for drone targeting. For the first few miles, nothing moved. No lock tones, no radar sweeps, only the steady rumble of twin RD-33 engines pushing him at 500 knots. And then two thin spirals of smoke lifted from a tree line ahead. Not full launches, not guided shots, just probing Eagler fire. Irregular, impatient, fired almost on instinct. The pilot banked left, then right, carving shallow arcs through the air. Each turn burned another 40 lb of fuel. His total loss climbed past 160 lb, and the mission had barely begun. Yet the real danger was not the missiles. It was the message those smoke columns carried. They rose straight into the sky like flare signals, visible for nearly 10 miles. Every Russian position within that radius would now be looking. Still, the cockpit remained silent. No warnings, no tracking. He dropped to 45 ft, letting the terrain swallow him. The mission was still intact, but the silence around him had changed tone. No longer calm, but waiting. 10:29 a.m. The first hard tremor of danger rolled across the cockpit. A Russian checkpoint hidden beneath a collapsed greenhouse roof fired 3 Eagler missiles within 5 seconds. No warning tones, no radar sweep, just 3 raw plumes clawing upward from different angles. Trusting speed and chaos to compensate for poor guidance. The pilot snapped the MiG into a maximum brake turn, 9.2 G. 2G pressing him into the seat until the edges of his vision trembled. All 3 missiles overshot, spiraling into the haze. But survival had a cost. Those maneuvers burned another 180 lb of fuel, pushing his total loss near 350. And he was still miles from the main objective. Then the sky betrayed a second secret. The smoke trails from those launches, thick, twisting, rising like white wires, stretched nearly 22 meters. Anyone watching from Russian lines would see them instantly. And someone was watching. A P-18 VHF radar, older than most of the soldiers operating it, began pulsing intermittent returns. Not a full track, but enough to whisper his approximate corridor ahead. He dipped again to 60 ft, threading between irrigation masts and low ridge lines. For a breath it worked until a factory roof appeared on the horizon. On top of it, another Igloo team. Their missile lifted before his mind finished registering the threat. He had no room, no terrain, no cover. The only escape was up. He pulled to 170 ft, bursting above the power line corridor he had been using for protection. Instantly, his SPO-15 lit with overlapping spikes. Multiple radars, different frequency bands. The entire sector was waking up. And before we continue, ask yourself this. If every radar between here and Crimea suddenly locked onto you, would you still push deeper? Tell me in the comments, what would you do? By what happened next, he did exactly that. 10:36 a.m., the moment the air itself began to vibrate. His SPO-15 threat receiver shifted from scattered chirps to a continuous rising cadence. Not random sweeps, not background noise. A Torm M2 battery had powered its tracking radar and was now stitching narrow beams across the valley. Searching for a clean lock, he opened the weapons page. The modified JDAM ER armed itself with a soft hydraulic click. Battery at 28 minutes. Guidance time needed barely 90 seconds. Glide profile calculated for roughly 42 minutes. That was his lifeline, but only if he could reach the release altitude before the Torm 2 completed its firing solution. Then the next blow landed. Russian electronic warfare spiked through the cockpit. The GPS constellation on his display collapsed. 7 satellites, 5, then 4, too few for precision. Without the Ukrainian-built inertial package bolted into the pylon, a ring laser gyroscope cluster that held a 10-meter drift for 2 full minutes, the weapon would have gone blind. He pushed the throttles into full afterburner. Twin RD-33 engines roared, throwing 36,000 lb of thrust into the climb. The MiG-29 surged upward in a high-speed yo-yo profile, converting 540 knots of forward momentum into raw altitude. Vertical speed touched 280 ms. The stall margin narrowed with every 9,000, 7,000. His HUD bled speed like a wounded animal. 420 knots, then 380, then barely 200, and the Torm 2 found him. A new tone knifed through the cockpit. Hard track. A firing solution was moments away. 11:05 a.m. 4 seconds remained in the release window. He held his breath, kept the wings level, resisted every instinct to maneuver. One wrong twitch would tilt the JDAM off its rails. 15,000 feet, 185 knots. He pressed the pickle. 28 explosive bolts fired with a dull metallic punch, kicking the 500 lb weapon free. It fell cleanly, tumbled once, deployed its diamond-shaped wings in a burst of white vapor, then locked onto its glide arc. Only then, 2 seconds later, did he allow himself to fight because the Torm 2 had already launched. A JDAM missile was now rising toward him at 800 ms. AM. The sky tore open behind him. The Torm M2 missile detonated barely 320 mm off his right wing, close enough for the shockwave to punch through the airframe like a steel fist. A fist-sized fragment hammered into the port engine, sending exhaust temperature surging into the red. The pilot throttled back, shut the crippled engine down, and waited for the firelight to flare. It never did. Small mercy, but not enough to change the odds. Then the second failure arrived. Hydraulic pressure bled away in seconds. The main circuit dropped to 0, the backup to barely 30%. Control inputs that once required ounces of pressure now demanded full arm heaves. Every roll, every pitch, every correction became 10 times heavier. The MiG-29 was still airborne, but only because Soviet engineers built redundancy into every ribbon joint. Behind him, the JDAM had already transitioned from glide to terminal dive. Its onboard computer updated its course through the inertial gyroscope cluster, holding drift under 10 mi, even with GPS reduced to 4 satellites. Speed built rapidly 280, then 300 ms, until the weapon carved through the roof of the Russian drone hub with the force of a falling meteor. It punched through 2 steel-reinforced floors, struck the primary support column, and then triggered its internal charge. Roughly 440 lb of controlled explosive force, optimized for structural collapse rather than spectacle. The blast ripped downward instead of outward, shattering load-bearing joints and vaporizing the central spine of the facility. 8,000 tons of concrete and grain began a cascading failure. Floor slammed into floor, accelerating at gravitational speed, each impact doubling the force of the one before it. In just over 6 seconds, the entire structure folded inward, collapsing into a dense plume of dust that rose 500 feet above the riverbank. Secondary flashes flared through the rubble as stored drone. Components overheated and failed one by one. His mission was complete. Now he only had to survive the trip home. 11 a.m. The river city ahead erupted before he even reached its outskirts. Hola, priest, usually a maze of quiet streets and low cement rooftops, had transformed into a layered gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. Every Zu-23 emplacement in the district seemed to ignite at once, unleashing intersecting sheets of tracer rounds that carved glowing arcs across the sky. They were not aiming at him, they were aiming around him, building moving walls of metal meant to compress him into a predictable path. The MiG-29 dropped to 600 ft, staying just above treetop height. With one engine offline, his thrust margin was razor thin. Any climb beyond a few dozen feet risked dropping his airspeed below the minimum needed to stay airborne. Yet every dive brought him closer to the curtain of fire. A cluster of rounds grazed the tail boom, slicing through 2 control cables and rattling the entire frame. Another burst punctured the starboard stabilizer, sending a harsh vibration through the pedals. The cockpit filled with warning lights, yellow hydraulic caution shifting to red, then pulsing red. His backup circuit, already straining under the workload, slipped to roughly 1/4 of its normal pressure. Control response slowed as if the aircraft were moving through syrup. Each roll took deliberate force. Each pitch correction bordered on a gamble. Still, he jinked small. Sharp 2G moves every 2 seconds to disrupt the predictive fire control math the gunners were relying on. Under normal circumstances on 2 engines, the maneuver pattern would have been routine. But with only a single RD-33 pushing the machine and the airframe absorbing more damage by the minute. Each evasive motion felt like balancing on the edge of a collapsing ladder. A final burst of tracers flashed across his canopy, missing by less than a truck length. He could see open terrain ahead, thin, wavering, but real. If he could reach it, he would break free of the kill zone and into the last stretch before Ukrainian airspace. 11:26 a.m. The city fell behind him, but the danger did not. The MiG-29 shuddered as crosswinds pushed against its wounded frame. With only a single engine producing thrust, the aircraft flew like a lopsided arrow, fast enough to stay alive, slow enough that every shift in air density could tilt it off balance. Hydraulic pressure hovered at barely 1/4 of normal capacity, and the control stick felt as heavy as an anchor. He nudged the rudder, countering a slow drift to the right. The damaged stabilizer protested with a grinding tremor. Airspeed settled around 460 knots, just above the minimum for stable flight with asymmetric thrust. Any lower, and he would sink into the terrain. Any higher and the weakened airframe risked structural failure. Ahead, the terrain opened into broad fields dotted with irrigation canals. This was the final barrier, the last 30 mi of occupied airspace. Russian spotters, aware of the collapsing drone facility behind them, were now calling grid after grid in a desperate attempt to pin him down. A mobile launcher fired a short-range burst. 3 quick tracers, barely guided, but they passed behind him and faded. A fuel warning tone buzzed through the cockpit. Internal tanks were down to the last reserves, enough for maybe 4 minutes of flight at this power setting. The pilot eased the throttle a fraction, balancing consumption against the risk of losing too much lift. Then at the end of a long wavering heat haze, he saw it. The boundary line? Not a fence, not a marker, just a widening stretch of unoccupied fields where Ukrainian early warning radars watched.